Blessings and welcome back, everyone, to our 23rd episode in our journey through the zodiacal faces. Hope you all had a happy Halloween. And I'm Elsa. I'm joined today by KD Dayton and David Fisher. We are here for Scorpio II. The dates for this being November 1st or 2nd through November 10th or 11th. Austin Coppock calls this an apparatus for mutual distillation, and Susan Chang calls it the golden hour. The sun being the sublord to Mars here, so Mars being the natural lord of Scorpio and having the sun as its secondary ruler here. And we've got the Six of Cups, which is the lord of pleasure. This decan coincides with the midpoint between the solstice and the equinox, so that'll have some kind of meaning as we move through, as well as Austin talks about this being one of the most stubbornly fixed faces in the entire 36. Do you guys have anything you want to comment on straight out of the gate with this decan?
Well, it begins on All Souls Day or the Day of the Dead. That's November 1st or 2nd. And so that actually really sets the tone for, I think, the whole decan, that remembrance of the dead piece.
And I want to also note the relationship between the ideas of the sun that we have already laid out a few times and of death combined, giving us this card that is a lot of the times associated with remembrance, but in that way, in that idealistic way. So you look at the past and you you select that which is most appeasing to your soul, let's say it like that, in a few ways from a particular situation. Yeah, so I just wanted to comment that quickly before we jump in.
Yeah, and another, there's a quote from Susan Chang that I highlighted that I was just going to read later, but it definitely pertains to what you just said, David, so I'm just going to go ahead and lead with it straight out of the gate. So, this, as we move through, we're kind of talking about like the sun looking forward, the future, or the sun like glamorizing the past, or anyway, this lord of pleasure, this six, we keep coming back to this idea of nostalgia and memory and past and things like this. So the takeaway here that Susan Chang talked about, and what I think David was referring to here on that theme, she says, whether we're, when we take this moment to sort of reflect and look back, whether the experience is sweet, bittersweet, or painful, you have to try to accept the moment without holding too tight. What is precious is transient, and what is transient is precious. In an emotional as well as a material currency, the measure of your wealth is not what you can hold on to, but what you can give away. And I just thought that was a really beautiful sort of synopsis of this decan, and we can just keep those themes in mind as we move through.
Yeah, because the sun and death just seems so opposite. How does it result in the really beautiful picture of the Six of Cups that we'll look at later? But another thing I wanted to mention before we dive in, which is I think quite interesting about the title of the chapter in Chang's book 36 Secrets, is the golden hour. The two different meanings of the golden hour. So on the one hand, it's the hour right after sunrise and before sunset that's known for being, for photographers, a very beautiful time to capture, nature and humans. The light is just really nice. But there's another medical meaning to the golden hour, which is the period of time right after a traumatic injury during which somebody's life can be saved. And that's called the golden hour. And I think that that's really important to remember, again, with this decan. That's a
wow,
that's significant. Yeah.
That is really cool. That is really beautiful. And when Susan Chang was talking about the golden hour for photographers and for art and stuff, like kind of casting the perfect light onto the human, she talks a lot about shadows like, because that's what we're looking for. Like, that's what makes our skin glow, or that what makes nature like beautiful or photogenic, is the way the shadows are falling. So when we think of, the sun as light, or maybe death as the shadow that sort of looms with us or follows us around, and what casts that shadow is sort of the light of life. So they're really this sort of paradoxical polarity. So they're not really that opposite. They're sort of like dependent on one another. The death cycle and the life cycle are kind of woven, which we did talk about in Scorpio 1 a lot. So you can check that out when we talked about just the complexity of the death card. But that really, we need that light to cast that shadow. And when we think about Scorpio in general, we kind of think of that sort of like shadowy, like underworld, and the same as the death card. So I thought that was a beautiful analogy, is just like the shadow versus the light, and that play that it has together.
Yeah.
And it sort of like is always looming and is always following us around.
And I think it's important to highlight that this decan is within the grounds of Scorpio. So we're talking about death's grounds here. And so being associated with the sun, it means that the sun is the sun, life-giving energy, consciousness is working within the need to cope with death, which is one of the things that Scorpio represent. Malefics represent that in general, but here in Scorpio, we have to face death, we have to face violence, we have to face many things that are unexpected. It's not just the concept of death, it's death happening to you in every way. Like, it's not something planned. It's that immediacy, urgency of a Martian scenario. Like we were talking about with the tower, the whole sign of Scorpio really is very Martian. Remember, it was a Mars decan. And so it has that kind of feeling to it. And the sun needing to cope with it here in this decan gives us, with the 6 of Cups representation on the Rider-Waite, 2 kids, and we are going to touch more on that. And they are symbols of purity. They are symbols of knowing how to deal with those things by not paying attention to them as much, just paying attention to the things that are appealing to your life force or to your understanding of who you are.
I think that's really cool because, it's also the fall of the moon. The moon can be a significator of children as well as mothers. And so it's just really interesting to see the symbols of children, which are also in like the sun cards, for instance, represented in this decan when it's the fall of that place in actuality.
Yeah, and we see the children as well in the death card and, in the sun card. And then we see them in this Lord of Pleasure card as well, which we can sort of unpack when we start to get into the tarot. But one thing I wanted to talk about as well is just that light and shadow play. And KD mentioned this at the top, which is it's, Dia de los Muertos, or the Ancestor Day, or Day of the Dead, or, All Souls Day. And wherever that falls for you, like whatever day that falls for you, I would encourage you, if you don't already, to make an offering to your ancestors. If you don't have an altar, you could do it outside. Maybe a little bit of alcohol that maybe, your father, your grandfather liked, or maybe a certain type of food, my grandfather has passed on, so he drank coffee every morning, so I use coffee or whatever. My great grandfather drank blackberry brandy, so I use blackberry brandy. So just those little things that you can do. And what I think just symbolically, and why I brought this up, is in Dia de los Muertos, they use the marigold as the symbolic flower for this day. So you just see them everywhere. So if you have a Day of the Dead celebration, like if you live in a city, I would encourage you to go to one if you haven't already. There's parades, there's things you can do in your local communities. Or if you do have access to flowers or marigolds or anything like that, using some of that, because She talks about cut flowers here because the little boy is giving the little girl like a flower or
Well, and
whatever.
a marigold seems like a super solar flower, is it
That's
not?
what I was, yeah, that's what I was saying is like,
yeah.
it's this bright orange and it's like,
Yeah.
you know, so
Like the
it's
sun.
exactly. So I think the symbolism of like using the sun marigold, like marigold is a so definitely magically like a solar flower in this sort of moment of like bringing the sun, this flower, this marigold, to the grave of someone who has died and remembering the dead using this sunflower, this solar image. Not the sunflower, but the marigold. I just thought was like just this perfect sort of symbolic representation that happens naturally in this Decan. So if you can get some marigolds or make a little ancestral altar and just sort of take note how you can like, and again, the cut flowers, right? Like you're taking it and taking away its life in order to offer it or in order to enjoy it, in order to symbolically represent your affections or love for someone else, or your affections or love for the altar or something like this. And in doing so, you're taking away the life force of the flower by cutting it from its natural environment or whatever. And therefore it has this sort of, you know, only so long to last, very fleeting symbolic quality as well.
Yeah, you know,
Beautiful.
It really is. It's beautiful. And I was really moved by some of the references to plants that I feel like came up here. Not always in the literature, but for me personally, I've been thinking a lot about the plant basil, which is a Martian plant. It's of Mars. And it's very peppery. That's why, and it has the pointy leaves, very sharp looking leaves. They're not actually sharp. But the other thing about basil is that it needs a lot of sun to grow. It really needs like just the right kind of sunlight too. That's kind of like moist, fertile, life-giving sunlight. So I feel like we often think of basil as a very summery plant, but around this time of year, I'm really thinking about that martial yet solar combination of energy, probably because it's going away, right? Right after Samhain here, like happy Samhain, everybody. Light is going away.
Scarce. I know it's you know, the funny thing in this like sort of everyday, because if you have T. Susan Chang's book, you'll know she gives like the everyday tarot. So she talks about like all of its symbolic nature, and then she's like, when I draw this card, because I don't know if you guys are familiar, how familiar you are with T. Susan Chang, but she keeps an entire spreadsheet of picking tarot all the time and keeping a spreadsheet and kind of doing statistics on how much she gets it and when she gets it and all of that, which is so cool.
Yeah.
Very Virgoan. But I was thinking about this yesterday because I was rushing to go out to see the sunset because we don't get that many nice days here and most of the leaves are off the trees, but you do see an orange or a yellow flash when most of the leaves have now gone off the trees and most things are brown. And just how fast the sun sets and how early the sun sets and just the grasping in the morning for it, just being like trying to beat the sun before it goes down to get out there and catch those last rays of the sun before it sets so quickly. And we were just commenting on just like how fast, like you can just watch it just dropping and it falls fast. Like in the summer, it feels like it takes a long time to go under the horizon, but yesterday it was like we had 2 minutes and it was just under. So just that fall of the sun, essentially. I'm not saying that it's the fall of the sun in astrological terms, but the falling of the sun descending behind the horizon and it getting colder and it being that midpoint between the equinox and the solstice and just that kind of quickness that we sort of are already missing the sun. Or, you know, that basil reminded me of that with the less sunlight and sort of the descent of light and the shadows and things like that.
Also, the representation of the two kids in the Rider-Waite depiction tells you about how you can spark. Remember, we just came out of the 5 of Cups and now you're at the 6. So it's just how you can come out of that state of lethargy that the 5 of Cups kind of leaves you at, and you are now reconnecting with your ideals. You're reconnecting with your inspiration in a way. And that's the sun within Scorpio. It is a mechanism that allows you to reinvent yourself And it brings that childlike quality of naivety and allowing yourself to be authentic in your naivety, like the fool somewhat. And so I find that interesting, that still thinking about how the scorpionic background is affecting the expression of this particular decan, and how the sun is trying to grasp to, life as things around it seem to die. That's why it's also a card of remembrance, right?
Remembering the good times, and T. Susan Chang does bring up photographs and remembering it as a photograph. She says it's not as much about enjoying the flower while you have it because it's so fleeting. It's about remembering getting the flowers from someone or something like this, the whole cut flowers thing. But the childlike thing coming off of the Lord of Sorrow or the Lord of Disappointment reminds me of like times when I've been like really agitated or down or something like this, and how much children can remind you and bring that smile and that spark. It's like, I have nieces and nephews, and if you're really sad or whatever, your sadness sort of pales in comparison to their little smiles and their little hugs and their, so it is just the idea of the childlike self being like, it's gonna be okay, or like, here's a flower, mommy, or whatever it is, they can really kind of get you out of that sorrow and into another perspective of like, so many times we're like, this is really hard, but I've got to do it for the kids, or I've got to, and that youth and that life can really bring us up and out of our cloud and into the perspective of like, I guess, progeny, or just like little kids, like, not that you should like put your sorrow aside or like stuff it or anything, but you're not going to be in that state when you're around kids. You're going to try to like lift yourself up and do what they need to do and use that care for them. So, she talks about lineage in that sort of memory. And she says, so when we're talking about the ancestors and going to put some, flowers on your ancestors' graves or Day of the Dead or these ancestral altars, T. Susan also talks about lineage having to do with memory and how it's a kind of relay race where the only prize is the love that we bear for one another from one generation to the next, and sort of like passing that love. And that's like what really survives. Speaking of passing, Austin calls this an apparatus for mutual distillation. So we've got that sort of sharing quality where each time it's, and let me just say this, in order to distill something, right, you've got these two like glass beakers or tubes or whatever, and then you've got them passing their fluids from one to the other. And even before I talk about like alchemy and tantra and like all of that kind of science that happens in distillation, I wanted to talk about heat, because I don't know if we talked as much about like this part of Mars, but Mars is really a cook. Mars is a chef. It's using knives, it's using heat. It's like, so, and that's one of the more positive significations again of Mars when we're talking about nourishment here of the moon and things like that. And I think that's maybe why we didn't get to it last time, because it's like such a malefic decan. But in this one, we're talking about like alchemy. We're talking about Mars, which is heat, and we're talking about the sun, and we need that heat to distill something. So before we even talk about like passing the energies, we're getting heat here, and a purified heat, right? And a heat of passion, because this Mars is heat and boiling, but it's more like, cutting, and then you add the sun, and then you've got all of a sudden this ability to like make fire, cook food, nourish, things like this.
And this is perhaps, from this perspective, one of the most fertile parts of Scorpio. And I use that word because the water signs are fertile by nature, multiple by nature. And here, when we have Mars and the Sun, two planets that are really to the point, they are selective, they are masculine in nature in that way. You really, I think, get to a kind of balance through harsh circumstances where you're able to have resilience to the point of, overcoming almost anything. And I think thinking about this decan perhaps as the key for going through trauma could be a way of studying it.
Yeah, Austin, yeah, it's funny that you say that, because Austin will like touch on this, or like, alludes to this idea, which is, before we've got this hunger, right? And this grasping. And here hunger has found a mate, right? So now we're looking at this mutual satisfaction or mutually assured destruction, because it's not just the one, now it's become the double, it's become some type of exchange. So the Six of Cups shows that we have a tender or affectionate image here. And then we add like the partner. It's no longer this lonesome hunger. It's partners locked in a creative or destructive exchange. And there's pleasure here, but there's also pleasure in, like, there can be pleasure in any Decan, really. Or some kind of delight in some kind of like polarity in every Decan where we can kind of find pleasure. Here, the affection that we see from the children is sort of natural or unconditioned, and that's what we're looking for like the highest polarity, I guess, of the sun or with the children, is that we would have those type of natural or unconditioned connections. I guess that's like the highest part of like the tantric path, or the connection that we're looking for is this sort of pure, natural, unadulterated expression. And that expression accompanies the expression of passion unencumbered by decorum, or, kind of these things that come with like adult natured, interactions between people. So ideally, it's a vision of ideal exchange between two parties that's sort of poignant and perfect. So this dynamic is identical to the alchemical process. This is where he brings it to the alchemical process of mutual distillation, whereas the matter passes back and forth, and it increasingly becomes rarefied and potent.
Again, that word selection from the sun comes to mind, and Mars being also an agent of exaction, of cutting, but also exerting exact action.
Exactitude.
Yeah,
because you're, by taking away, let's just say it's at its most basic point, distillation is taking out everything but the most basic. You're taking out all the water, and you get more and more potent idealized matter as you go. Idealized matter as you go. So you're taking out the water, and you get increasingly rarefied and potent. And to me, yeah, you're right. It's selecting the ingredients and purifying the ingredients. And it's also sort of cutting away the impurities, or removing the purities in some way, or the impurities in some way. So then he starts to talk about mutual distillation in sort of a tantric practice. So yoga tantra, or Taoist sexual energy practice, whereas, this dual cultivation is exchanged between two partners, right? And it gets ever and ever higher as the partners exchange their love and their energies up through the chakras to a sort of an enlightenment state or something like this, right? And even if we don't take it as like, this practical, like I'm practicing yoga to reach enlightenment through sex with the other or something, it is part of what we're naturally looking for in connection with others, is a pure, sort of like unadulterated, a natural sort of like climb, and not just in climax, but in connection with the other. So he talks then about like that being the potency of the children, and then as adult partners, what we sort of hope for, or what we're aiming towards to exchange, distilling that sexual energy more so than we could produce just on our own, and talking about how this Decan really wants that. But he looks at all relationships, and not just sexual relationships or partnership relationships, but all relationships rely on trust and continuous exchange to generate such types of circuits. So you need, so this is the kind of balancing act that you have to have, is this trust and exchange. And I think that's what we're trusting and exchanging when it comes to the authenticity and selection of the sun, and then this sort of authenticity and selection of death, right? Is they're making an exchange between seasons, and it does require a lot of vulnerability and a lot of trust. So he says, no matter the context, such exchanges require deep trust, intimacy, and therefore vulnerability. There can be no dual cultivation without nakedness. And that's the same with the herbs, right? You have to strip them down, wash them, and you're sort of making them more and more rarefied, more and more naked, stripping them. So also in this Decan, we find the willingness to forsake safety for intimacy. Ibn Ezra describes a woman who's left her house, she's naked and she has on nothing, and she's entering the sea. You know, so she's left her home unclothed, and she's entering this like mysterious body of water, this cold body of water, right? And she's forsaken her safety in order to create some kind of intimacy, looking for something. She's abandoned her protections. And he's saying that this face, or this Decan, is more than just these passionate embraces. It's about being stripped naked. It's about the trust without wisdom is ultimately a sure recipe for pain. So also you have this virtuous circuit of exchange that can become super vicious in this phase. So it can become super corrupted, and this process of dual cultivation can also be mutual degeneration, destroying the quality of each other with each pass, right? So you can think of like destructive arguments or like toxic relationships, where each time you make a pass with each other, it becomes more and more toxic. And again, that's talking about like poisons, right? When you're making poisons, you can distill, you know, lead into gold, or you can make poisons potent through this distillation process as well. And then he goes on to talk about all the images that we see, where we see bits of destructive energy, two dogs biting at one another, deceit, false dealings, things like this. And we'll see a little bit when we come to the Picatrix as well. And then I know I have a lot to say on this particular Decan when it comes to Austin, but he also talks about in the 36 Heirs of the Zodiac, the story of Leto. Am I saying that right? Leto or Leto? Do you know?
It's Leto.
Leto. Okay. The story of Leto. So Leto is the mother of Apollo, the sun god, and the sun god's twin sister Artemis, the moon. And so Leto was not really worshipped alone, but always worshipped because of her celestial children. And then he talks again about the sun and the moon, or the king and the queen, being like the very crux of all these alchemical operations. So it's about the spirit and the body of matter. And that's how we get, you know, that's at the heart of our alchemical sort of psychology and practice. So, you know, they're aiding each other and cruelly sabotaging each other, right, in this story. And the sun and the moon are kind of, you know, representing that they're sort of linked in this way, like they're inextricably linked, kind of like how the sun and death are as well, right? Like that kind of cycle is inextricably linked, like the sun and the moon. And so he said sort of fixity of relationship is a key characteristic of this Decan. Those who move through this phase also establish like fixed relationships with people, places, and areas of study as well. So when we're thinking of like alchemy and science and distillation, or even like cooking or things like that, it's something that really fixes you to the Decan. And I wanted to bring this up, actually. I don't know if I've mentioned this. For those of you who don't have Austin's book, we are doing like a very brief outline of his chapters. He actually has how each planet will act in the Decan, and we're just looking at the Decan itself as a general significator. But then he goes on to say how Saturn acts, how Mars acts here, how the Sun acts here, like all of those things. So I just wanted to note that. I've been wanting to sort of tell you guys that for a while, that it's not, this is just kind of a keynote. And so don't get too crazy, because you might have different planets here, you might not have the Sun, you might, and so it's really nuanced when it comes to this Decan, how this Decan will act depending on which planet you have there. So that's just a side note. But yeah, so he talks about how fixed, really fixed this is, and if you have something here, how it's going to really fix you into areas of study or people or places or relationships or something like that. So then he talks magically how this can really intensify a cycle of corruption, or how it can be used as a benevolent exchange between two entities as well. So I think that's where I'm going to end here. I think that kind of gives us something to stand on as far as what Austin talks about this Decan revealing. And we can build off that when we're looking at the cards. And you can easily see how we've got the Sun and the Death, and even the two little children exchanging their gifts of flowers, and kind of like the hope that our distillation will bring this sort of unencumbered intimacy and vulnerability, like we see with the kids, which is just this beautiful little exchange of this fleeting moment of these beautiful flowers given freely and sweetly, or something like that, you know? Okay.
I think that with that last thing you said about the kid giving something of beauty, it's a boy giving something of beauty to a girl. So it is the choice of the conscious mind to really engage with the subconscious, with the feminine, the multiplicity within oneself, by giving it beauty, by adding beauty to it. What does that mean? Well, you are constantly drawing on things that are part of your experience to judge things in your present. If you choose to consciously engage with those memories that you're drawing from in a more, in a lighter way, and trying to add some beauty into your daily routine, so you can start drawing from that. And not just beauty, but people who inspire you, all of those things, you are treating your subjective side, that little girl, with care, with you're properly caring for it, for your subjective.
Yeah.
side.
Yeah, that's really interesting and beautiful. T. Susan talks about when she drew this card, it was the first day that she had started the yearly ritual of putting a bunch of flower pots on her porch, hanging flower pots and stuff like this, that had become like a ritual for her. And I agree, like, and I think in that innocence of like wanting to be connecting, and in your child body, you're not like worried about the body, you're not worried about the mind, you're just like wanting to have fun and connect with the other person. It's like in the spring when I go out on walks with the kids, they'll see a flower and they'll just run up and they'll pick it and they'll be like, here, TT, or whatever, you know, like they see something beautiful and they want to share it. It's not like they're thinking like, I'm going to pick this thing and kill it. They're just like, it's an expression, an unbridled expression of love. They're just like, pretty, I love you, here you go. It's just like coming out of this like pure generosity. Do you know what I mean? Of just like wanting to connect and share and show your love. And I think that's what, you know, Tantra is like aiming for, is to get there, like in our adult minds and in our spiritual minds, of this giving quality of like, there's beauty all around us and we want to share it with someone, essentially. You know? And I think that's what the Sun and Death talk about too, is like, we could die tomorrow and, you know, we're just in this sort of like mashup of ancestors. Let's like enjoy the day today, kind of a thing, you know? Katie, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think we can start looking at some of the tarot cards that really reinforce everything you just said. There's a lot of themes that I'll probably be calling back to that you shared from Austin's book. So I have tarot cards here from a variety of different decks for Death, which is the card of Scorpio, the Sun, which is the ruler of this decan, and the Six of Cups. We've seen Scorpio in the last video or the Death in the last video for Scorpio 1, and we'll see it again in the next video. But I thought these specific depictions on the screen right now are pretty, I think, specifically interesting for this decan. And I'll point out a couple of reasons why in some of the symbolism here. But I did want to start by noting that I learned in reading Chang's chapter in 36 Secrets that the young girl at the bottom right of the Rider-Waite-Smith iteration of the Death card is actually the same girl that we see in the card Strength, who is wearing the crown of flowers and taming the lion. So, you know, even Strength looks away in the face of death. So I'm not sure if that's specifically relevant to this decan, but I did learn it during this decan in her book. And I thought that was a really interesting piece of the puzzle, you know, that makes this death card somehow relevant to Strength, which is also, by the way, the card of Leo, which is the sun sign. So there's a lot of correlations going on there. We talked in the last video too about the moon scene being mimicked in the background of the Death card with the two towers and the river. There is a sunset going on right behind it. So in another way that's fairly interesting, the Death card being sort of the opposite of the sun, you were also talking about the moon being sort of opposite of the sun, and moon and death are being very strongly emphasized in the Death card. And it's really beautiful when you think about that attention to detail that Pamela Coleman Smith went into planning these sorts of symbols in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck.
Absolutely. And I was going to say, it's cool that you brought up the moon in this case, but I was going to say, you know, the sun setting and Strength being associated with the sun or Leo, and the sun is sort of like going down on the scene, and she's sort of like looking away from the scene and sort of like passing that energy to the moon in a way.
Yeah.
You know, like,
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Just kind of releasing. And, you know, in reading Chang's chapter as well, there was a mention of how, you know, we often casually refer to death as an opportunity for transformation and rebirth. But just as an ending can often look like a new beginning, or vice versa, a beginning can look like an ending. While we know from context that this is a sun setting, you could also imagine the sun rising, and it being the new day that we confront the death that has happened, but, you know, with a new outlook and a new hope. So that's just a little bit reiterating some things about the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but I have a couple other cards that we didn't see in the last video that I want to talk a little bit about. First, we have the Science deck, which depicts death as phase transition, which is kind of a fancy phrase for, you know, when water changes states from a liquid to a solid when it freezes, to a gas when it evaporates, to a steam, which is just another lighter form of the moisture in the air. But in this case, this is an ice skull that is melting. The sun is shining on it, and it's melting down. So the skull itself is disappearing, right? But the theoretically water that the skull frozen ice was made out of is just in a different form now. It doesn't disappear. It's going to be something else. It's just the sun is shining so hard that it's melting.
I think this is so beautiful for this decan, Katie, because of the fact that, remember how we talked about Scorpio being fixed water or iced over water, or like a well or cold water or frozen water, right?
Right
and
here.
then we've got the frozen skull being sort of melted by the sun. And I think that's a little bit of what we're talking about as far as like the vibe of the decan, which is like our hearts being vulnerable or like melting a little bit, like to be in that sort of relational quality is like the hardness of the heart or the emotions or the fixity needs to sort of melt into vulnerability, like, and that sun provides a little bit of that heat in order to, you know, in order to you know, distill the herbs. We need that sun, or in order to melt that ice or that fixity of the water or something like this. So this card is, again, the science deck surely does not disappoint.
They did their shit right. Next to the science deck, we have the tarot deck made by the artist Micah Ulrich. And what I found pretty cool about this depiction of death is that death seems to be holding a sheath of wheat, and there are some what look like plants or sprouts on the side. So it almost calls to mind when we talk about memory, like the memory of the harvest being strong, you know, in the last moments of death, like really holding on to that last harvest to some extent, which I also thought was pretty relevant to the sun. Again, the sun nourishing those things, allowing the plants to grow, ripening them, and, you know, sustaining us for so long from death and starvation.
Yeah, it reminds me of the last decan of Virgo too, where we talked about like the sarcophagus, like happening at the end of harvest, or the grim reaper, right? Like reaping the harvest and the wheat and something like this. And then also I included a video link in the last Scorpio 1 video that we put out. And it's a channel that I love and watch that talks about like in the link that I included, it's a story about you know, what we did with our dead and burial and death, and like the first deaths and the first burials that we found, the first grave sites, the first intentional burials and things like this. It's a super awesome video. But they would find in these, you know, intentional burials pollen. And so they know that there was, or they think, or they suspect that they're being buried with, and we know definitely in the Egyptian pyramid burials, there would always be seeds. You're always burying your loved ones with, and now we put flowers in, right? We're always putting the seed or the harvest or the flower or some kind, you know. Yes, exactly. So I think that's really poignant that you brought that up, and really beautiful.
Yeah, that is beautiful. I didn't know that, and I'm gonna do some I think Wikipedia wormholing after this to read about that. Very appropriate for Halloween weekend. So and then the last card on the far right is from the cat deck, which I love. I always just have to plug it because it's so cute. Death is represented by a vacuum here, and yet still it has the sun in the background, the sun setting, which I think is a theme that would be important to look out for among death cards, because it doesn't necessarily seem completely intuitive that that would be such an integral part of death. But what was really clear to me from reading Chang's chapter and doing my own kind of comparison in a lot of different tarot decks, that again, the sun and death are in constant opposition. There's like a polarity that's just super consistent, and neither one ever wins. You know, it's a constant back and forth. So I wanted to compare side by side some of the things that would tell us this from the again, the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. Both of these figures are on horseback, so they both have the power of horses there. And if you're familiar with the Orphic hymns, both the sun and the moon have references to being lovers of, or of steeds, of horses. So the horse is a really, I think, important symbol here in both of these cards, as well as, I don't know if you're familiar with the red feather theory here. The red feather on the top of Death's cap is the same red feather that's coming from this little kid's headdress, and it's the same red feather as well that appears in the Fool card, which is sticking out of his hat in the Fool card. So the idea being that this red feather is kind of like following the Fool through this process, but by the time it gets to Death, it's just wilted, and it's you know, in its last throes of surviving there.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting also to see the red flag. I know red can be a sun you know, color, but it's also a Martian color. So to see the red flag in the sun card and then see the golden robe in the death card or whatever, I think that's kind of a little bit of a sharing, kind of like a mutual distillation of just some symbolic color themes moving through.
For sure. For sure. But we have a couple other depictions of the sun I wanted to throw up briefly. We've seen sun cards before throughout a few other decans. I think all the way back in Aries too, it was the first one we saw it. But we have, again, children are a really, really common theme in sun cards. And so that's something interesting when we see different depictions of the Six of Cups, often having children in them as well. But I thought that the two-ness of the sun in the Pythagorean deck, which is Elsa's deck here on the far right, and also in the Scapini deck, as well as the two child figures in this Renaissance Golden Tarot deck. There's this two-ness element to it, which I think is really interesting. It calls to mind the lovers and Gemini season and things like that. And, you know, there's a real element of duality, I think, that speaks to that death sun polarity that can be seen in each one of these cards. But I really like the Scapini deck specifically for its combination of both the horse and the twos. So
I agree. And like when we were thinking, and again, Austin calls it mutual distillation, and it's about tantra, and it's about like how we can achieve like sexual or spiritual liberation more so with sharing it with another than we can on our own or something like this, right? And then we have the, you know, Artemis Apollo thing happening, and just the idea that we're sharing energies back and forth. And one of the joys, I guess, if you think of like sun is joy, one of the biggest joys you can get is to sort of like share with someone, or like light up somebody's face, or give them a gift, or like love them, or see them happy. You know, like we get a lot of joy in humanity through giving and through sharing, like much more than sometimes getting ourselves a gift. Not that we couldn't revel in self treating or something like this, you know, but it's just definitely like something in making someone else feel good and sharing those experiences, like heighten our awareness of our own happiness and things like that, you know, or heighten our experiences of death as well, right? By having that reflection of the other. Like if I just die, that's one thing, but if you die, it's another, you know? So it's like, again, that kind of like duality and polarity. And I love how we see the fungi in the circle on the Pythagorean deck. And then we also see that same sort of natural circle of life in the Scapini deck. And I just want to bring that out for people because, you know, I had mentioned in the past where it looks like the image of the walled garden that we see in Taurus, that we see these Gemini like twins in, and then we see that sort of circle of life, like the mycelia running under the surface, which we talked about last time, or that sort of like natural component of the circle of life, quote unquote, we kind of see in the Scapini. So that seems to have a huge sort of symbolic impact on that life and death natural cycle, the sun and the death card.
Yeah, it really does. It really does, especially with the fungus. I think that's really, really good to point out.
And again, red fungus, you know, that
fungus.
Martian and Mars and the sun both share red. So red is a really strong quality, a really magical sort of thing to bring in during this decade. So bring red into your life.
For sure. And, you know, a lot of times we, in a similar way, we associate the sign of Scorpio, and especially the card of death with darkness, maybe the color black or even shadow. I wanted to read a quote from 36 Secrets in reference to this. Chang says, "In full daylight, our shadow invites us to contemplate the whole left behind when we are gone. You don't simply vanish, you leave an imprint, a memory, a U-shaped shadow in the hearts of those who love you. To thrive in life is to cultivate the shadow. The brighter the light, the stronger the loss." And
that brighter the light, the stronger the loss thing I highlighted. I was going to bring that up too if no one else said it, because again, I'm going to have you go back to the Scorpio 1 video. There's a link in there, Grief and Praise by Martín Prechtel, and he talks about that very thing, like the strong, you know, that kind of impact that you have. What is it again? The brighter the light, the
stronger
the loss, right?
Yep.
So it's like that impact of leaving the hole or the shadow or something like that on your loved ones. Again, the twins, the two, the kind of reflection of the sun and the moon, the mutual distillation, and the joy that you share in that, and the impact of that loss that it has. Yeah,
it's beautiful, and it was it definitely made it click to me, the similarities between the sun and death. But here we have a few different depictions from various decks of the Six of Cups. So in the top left is the Rider-Waite-Smith version, which is the two children in a really idyllic scene. It really doesn't look like any other card when you think about it in the whole deck. It just, these sort of residential dwellings behind it, so close up. It has like a very golden hour type of sheen over it, like this is right before sunset or something, and everything looks really saturated and beautiful. So that's the typical depiction that we see in the Rider-Waite-Smith deck, but it's very common across most of the decks that I've looked at to have children. So this is another example of that, of a child surrounded by six cups.
That's a beautiful image. That particular card is so beautiful. And you know what I think of, especially with the two cards that we just looked at, the Rider-Waite-Smith and the one below it with the little child, is like, it looks so idyllic because it has this like venture of definite beauty, but like safety. And if you think about like tantric connection with another person, it's like you need to feel safe, and not just safe in the sort of arms or reflection or psychological nature of the other in order to get naked with them and all that trust, but it's just like safe and secure in the presence of like God, almost, to be able to let go that deeply, like safe and secure that the other person is not just holding you in their psyche, but the fact that that space that we create with one another allows us to sort of let go into our own like most vulnerable childlike nature. And it just looks so divine in both of these, where the kids are just, they're totally protected, they're totally safe, the light and the flowers are surrounding them. You just see this ability to be at your most essential nature.
Absolutely. It's such a contrast then when you move over one to the right with these, again, this is the Scapini deck. And, you know, it is the same sentiment, but the very opposite side of it, which is that this card shows 6 different ways that one can confront old age and death. So each cup has a figure next to it that is showing how faith, specifically religion, spirituality, has ended up affecting them. We have this is from a short write-up about it on the website. We have a widow up here, a Christian widow, and then we have a pagan. This is a pagan. Ooh, scary. We have a wizard here, and then we have a witch, and then we have somebody that's supposed to represent a yogi, I believe, and then a sort of typical Grecian monk in the bottom right. So it's 6 different ways that people let their faith carry them into old age, essentially. And I think, again, I feel like it's the opposite side of the same coin. You know, we see youth in the other side, but it's at this old age that one would be hearkening back to the youth of this card, you know.
Yes.
And this is the reality in the Scapini deck.
Yes, and it's this reality that both T. Susan Chang and Austin Coppock allude to, which is it can be a mutual distillation for like tantric bliss with the other, or it can be mutually corrupting or something like this. And if religion is a perfect example of that, where it like aims to the highest ideals of light and sort of, again, stripping us away to our most essential and beautiful nature and giving us hope, and then really how it can like denigrate or carry us into old age. And I think, you know, T. Susan Chang talks about that as like those moments of that little baby. It's like they're so fleeting. We all know that we have millions and millions of pictures of our kids and our nieces and nephews when they're children, and just like, oh, you grow up so fast. It's like, you know, you're just like looking back constantly to the glory days of the children and how quickly they grow. And we do that with ourselves too. Like all of a sudden you will find yourself in old age, and those like glorious moments will be a memory of the past. So it's kind of perfect to put them side by side here, because it is very much the death and the sun. And when we've got sun here, we're illuminating the factor of death, right? Like we're able to bring consciousness to the fact that we will die. And I think that is also represented in the religious nature of these cups.
It is kind of, I do not in any way adhere to the Scorpio equals 8th house thing, but it really is a sun in the 8th house type vibe that I get from this iteration of the 6 of Cups in this Capini deck.
Yeah, it's like right before death or old age, and you're forced to reckon with your upcoming death, the sun floating down towards the descendant, which we see in almost every card here. So I hear you on that for sure.
But one thing I want to bring out again is the principle of selection of the sun. Really, all of those people in this Capini deck, they have a motto, something that guided them through life. We see the religion depicted. We see the relationship that was the reason for one's life that was lost. We see a lot of belief systems, in other words. And belief systems with the science deck, and belief systems that carry you through life up until old age. And here in the science deck, we have the whale carrying her baby to open sea, return to sea. So the mother goes to this specific place where it's safer and has more food. The water is just right, so she can have her babies. And then she goes back into open sea with them once they're a little grown. For the baby, this is a totally new journey into something vast, unknown, but it feels safe because of the mother. It can draw strength from the surety of the mother, right? The assertiveness of the mother that is just returning somewhere that it knows. And that will carry that whale into old age, those habits, which it will also pass on to its children. So I want to bring out the principle of selection here from the sun, because this is the distillation process that we have throughout our lives in relationship to other people. If we approach life and its challenges, being conscious of who we are, who we want to become, keeping that in mind, trying to adhere to some kind of higher principle and stick to it in a way, we can really become the best versions of ourselves in that particular scenario. But that only happens really if we test ourselves out in relationships to other people and really try to bring out that truth from within ourselves.
Yeah, and just a little slightly just darker, that just made me think of this, like, as it's not on the science deck, but what you're saying, David, is all these people are forced to reckon within old age. They've had these belief systems that have like gotten them through their life of hopes and fears and all of this stuff. But it's like, I can imagine at the very last moments of life before death, you have like extreme questions. Like, it's like I put my whole like apples into this jar and been pious or been, you know, whatever it is. And like, there's still a mystery ahead of me. Like, there's something that religion sort of like fails, no matter which one it is, or belief system sort of fail, because it's just that it's belief, and it sort of does pale in comparison to the confrontation with death, shall we say, you know?
Yep, 100%. Well, I was gonna say that your description of this card is really beautiful, David. I think on a macro level, like on a really high level, what this card is referencing is that both the whales in the foreground and the dolphins in the background are mammals, right? Which basically means that, you know, millions of years ago, some sea-dwelling creatures climbed out of the ocean and decided to make their like ecological niche on land, right? And they became mammals. Like eventually they evolved into mammals. But then somehow, as if drawn by memory, some of those mammals went back into the sea. They returned to the sea and they became mammals of the sea, which is weird, right? It's like, why'd you do that? Everybody else went the one direction and you decided to go back. And but it's really beautiful, again, the idea that they would do that through some sort of like almost ancestral memory, or like basically genetic baked in memory of where they came from. Why would they go back to the sea?
You know, and that's huge, because we do know now, the more science starts to, the more we know about evolution and science and like our ancestral memories, like we do carry this sort of genetic ancestral imprint, as far as like we might not even know consciously, like through the sun, that we're carrying this deep oceanic well of ancestral memory coming through us or whatever. So I really like that here. I like how both of these cards have these deep blue waters kind of a thing, but it's like they're kind of safe. They're not out in the middle of the ocean like David was saying, but you also see the horses here, the seahorses, or like the, you know, all of the creatures. When I think of Scorpio, I really do think of like underwater creatures. I mean, completely, like creatures that live in the deep and dark like parts of the ocean. You've got all these like weird kind of like, you know, they kind of light up, and you know, and even just the mammals that are, you know, doing these migrations through the water. I just really do think of like sea creatures in this way, or you know, last time I mentioned sirens or seahorses, or all this kind of like imaginative mystery of, you know, underneath the ocean.
Yeah, I really love this card as well. The from the Mother Peace deck, the 6 of Cups with 3 people on horses and 3 people on seahorses, like you mentioned. And then we got the sun in the background again, which I think is significant and intentional to have the sun back there. But the description of this card is that each of these figures is in kind of some sort of nirvana or orgasmic or orgiastic ecstasy. I'm not sure which one is the right the right phrase for that, but it really reminds me of what you were talking about earlier in Austin's work, Elsa, about the tantric practice of that can be very much related, like the Kundalini side of this Decan, and then this card is really harkening back to that.
Yeah, and tantric practice is just that. It's like we're aiming towards like almost recreating some ideal that we have naturally. Like kids are almost in an orgasmic, authentic expression, right? Like children, like they're just like out in nature and they're like pretty flowers, like they're in some kind of like beautiful psychedelic state of just like joy and bliss and sharing and
Yes.
awe of the world, right? When we're thinking about orgasmic bliss or tantric bliss or any of these things, we're literally looking to heighten our energies and practice getting back to that stage, right? And kind of allow and create a safe enough space and kind of like move our energies through our crap and our traumas and distill them down to their most natural state, which is like love, joy, peace,
Well,
spiritual awareness.
you know that they, you know what le petit mort, or
Yeah.
Yeah, the small death, and that's what we call orgasms, you know.
Yeah.
It's like a small death, and so I feel like that sort of orgasmic ecstasy is super relevant to this Decan specifically.
Absolutely. And we do think of like that blissful nature in water, and water does like make the body lighter, just physically lighter as well. So that's something to, think about when we're thinking about the waters of Scorpio and this sort of illumination quality of the sun.
Well, that was all I had for cards this time.
Thank you, Katie. Just to bring out now a few significations from the Picatrix, which agree, and some that are a little off from everything that we said, as usual. The Picatrix says some of those sometimes. But it says, it rises in the second face of Scorpio, a man riding a camel, holding a scorpion in his hand. This is a face of knowledge, modesty, settlement, and of speaking evil of one another, gossip.
Gossip girl.
This is the face of knowledge. Again, that reference to the sun as well, the sun being Lord of all knowledge and stuff. There's a man riding a camel with a scorpion in his hand. So it holds dominion over its primal instincts. This is how I interpreted it in my mind. So it holds power over their primal instincts through knowledge. The camel represents endurance. Again, this is the first characteristic that comes to mind. And resourcefulness as well, because it's full of what it needs in its body. Again, fixed water.
Yeah, just the reference. I was going to say that. To me, that was just the reference to fixed water and like under the surface, like water under the surface, like holding on, like the fixity, right? The holding on to the water for later or something like this. That's exactly what I got from it.
And so these are a few of my thoughts. It says of speaking evil of one another, but I don't really have any.
It's a sharp tongue or a harsh tongue that Mars can have, I feel like, especially when you're talking about in relationship to the other. It's corrupting.
Passing judgment.
Yeah, and it's corrupting the other. It's like if the sun is selection and we're talking about more than one here, we're talking about people together. It's like using that scorpionic poison. When I was thinking of the person holding the scorpion, I was thinking about like we have this idea to like nourish ourselves from the camel or poison ourselves with the scorpion, right? And so like we can see that in this Decan that we're either distilling like a beautiful medicine or we're distilling poison, right? And that's what we get when we're using martial qualities with the other. We can, fight or F or something like this, right? And both of those things are like you say, effing someone over or, like talking shit about someone is like poisoning them. It's like a magical, like if word is magic, right? It's kind of like using that poison against the other is how I took it, or one of the iterations. I mean, you definitely, the Picatrix gets you going on your symbolism for sure, like how we can look at the nature of those things. But yeah, that's what I was thinking. I was just like, man, that's like one way like that we really spread toxicity when we're alchemizing with the other, is talking crap about people, like for the sake of our own pleasure, our own fun or something like that, or trying to spread bad word about somebody is a very martial thing to do. And it's also when we were talking about like its feminine iteration, quote unquote, it's like you're not actually stabbing someone in the back with a knife or with a weapon. You're not actually physically harming them. You're harming them emotionally, right? By like talking bad about them to someone else, by ruining their reputation. You're spreading poisonous like vibes essentially. So nativities, who do we have this time? I forgot to mention last time, Chris, we didn't do that. The video was so long, we didn't even do the nativities last time in Scorpio 1. I'm going to put in the comments, like last time in Scorpio 1, we had Christopher Columbus, which I thought was like a really like heavy hitter for that Decan. Who do we have this time? What do we got going on?
So this was a really cursory look, but a few people that I found were Matthew McConaughey, the actor, Tilda Swinton, Ethan Hawke, Emma Stone, Lorde, the singer, Joni Mitchell, the singer, and Neil Gaiman, the author, and Tracy Morgan, another actor.
Oh, that's really interesting. It is kind of interesting to take a general look, but like I said before, you guys, this is just like an overview of some of the ancient ways that we're looking at the Decans themselves. And then obviously in practice, it's a little bit different. So again, when we're talking about nativities, when we're talking about these Decans, and I had one of our viewers say like, wait, I'm confused. Like they're new to astrology and they're like, what the heck is this Decan stuff? Like what's going on? We're not necessarily interpreting your nativity when we are talking about these Decans. So keep that in mind. And each planet is going to act very different here. And sometimes we can see like an overarching pattern when we bring in these nativities, and especially if you're looking at their charts in general. But I just wanted to kind of disclaimer that.
And one example of that is the lyrics for Both Sides Now, which was recorded by Joni Mitchell earlier in her career and now has been re-recorded later on in her life in a much darker, somber tone, which is very depressing, but do listen to it because it's beautiful. And what she says right at the beginning of the song is rose and flows of angel hair and ice cream castles in the air and feather canyons everywhere. Looked at clouds that way. She looked at cloud that way. But now they only block the sun, the rain. They rain and they snow on everyone. So many things I would have done, but clouds got in my way. And then the chorus is, I've looked at clouds from both sides now. Well, she ends up, she talks about clouds and a lot of other things. But the last chorus goes, I've looked at life from both sides now, from win and lose, and still somehow, it's life's illusions I recall. I really don't know life at all. So it's perfect, I think, for illustrating the feeling of the Six of Cups.
Oh, completely. And clouds being just like that iteration of water and very scorpionic and kind of like the illusion of life and death and all of that. Also, isn't Joni Mitchell the one that has the song Paved whatever to put up a parking lot? Paved paradise to put up a parking lot, right? And then she's like, you don't know what you've got till
yellow
it's gone,
taxi.
right? You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's a very sun death.
Wow, yeah.
Thing,
Big Yellow Taxi is another song, yeah.
It is.
Yeah, exactly. So you can see like when we're talking about this stuff, some of it's abstract and like don't go crazy on like, oh, the chart or whatever. Like you can see some of these threads coming through, just like we saw this lyric in this native or whatever, really iterating the general scope landscape. That was a good one, David. Yeah, thank you. And thank you for bringing up some of the nativities, Katie. So where can people find you?
I'm at kddayton.com and at kddayton on Instagram and Twitter, and on Instagram I'm kd_Dayton.
Awesome. Thank you. And thank you for being here once again. And David, where can people find you?
I am in the first place astrology.com, and I'm also on Instagram with in the first place astrology handle, on Twitter at first place astro, and I'm also on YouTube, on Facebook, and you can contact me for readings, for tarot and card readings in general, and also tutoring sessions in astrology. Don't forget to like, subscribe, comment, drop a little hat emoji, drop a little, I don't know, skull emoji.
Yeah, definitely get those Halloween and scorpionic emojis flowing in the comments below. Thanks for mentioning that, David. Yeah. Hope you all had a happy Halloween. This will probably come out a little bit after Halloween. I hope you all really enjoyed your celebrations and made your ancestral altars and things like this. You can find me on the About section. You can find all of us on the About section of this page. I will get a website up, I promise you guys, but you can contact me for readings just directly, as well as we do have an Instagram page. We have the Hellenistic Astrology Instagram page that you can definitely follow us on over there. It's not super active, but definitely we're trying to, connect with you over there as well. So if we shall close out this session, KD, would you like to ring us out with a poem?
Yes, I would. I always love ringing us out with a poem. This is from the end of T. Susan Chang's chapter in 36 Secrets. It's called Nothing Gold Can Stay by Robert Frost. Nature's first green is gold, her hardest hue to hold. Her early leaf's a flower, but only so an hour. Then leaf subsides to leaf, so Eden sank to grief. So dawn goes down to day, nothing gold can stay.
mata oka ka sama yo bekana soba da soba kena mata iba nakawati ma bekana soba and soba ate iba nake ujuna ba ikana kamaya ta onga ija koyo okoyo masena mata ibe kana sabaso inna tabaine